Hello, my name is Raffaello Pantucci, and what I'm delighted to welcome you today is the first of kind of a bigger experiment that we're trying at YCW, which is to try to host a global series of events. And the series we're trying to focus on is looking at China's borderlands. And the idea of this is to try to look beyond some of the kind of broader narratives that we see in the public discourse a lot, which is focused a lot on sort of China's maritime relations, China's relations with Taiwan, how China in the Indo-Pacific is playing out, to try to look instead at some of the more underexplored Chinese border relations, looking across China's land borders. China is a country that has 16 land borders with other countries, an incredibly diverse set of countries, including, it must be said, Afghanistan, which of course is going through an incredible moment of turmoil right now. And so the purpose of this series is to try to have a conversation about each of these borders in turn. And what we're going to be doing over the next months, this project might stretch out to a year, and we're perfectly fine with that, is to host a series of webinars like this to try to engage and talk about each of these in turn. And so what we thought we'd do to kick us off on this global series was to start with a broad overview. And we're really delighted and honored to be joined to do this by Professor M. Taylor Fravel, who is the Arthur and Ruth Sloan Professor of Political Science and the Director of Security Studies Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Professor Fravel is a widely known expert on China's borderland relations. I personally am a big fan of his book, Strong Borders, Secure Nation, Cooperation and Conflict in China's Territorial Disputes, which was put out by Princeton University Press in 2008. And I was trying to scramble around to find my copy to wave at the camera ahead of this event, but unfortunately I couldn't find it in time. But he's written a lot of stuff since then, including most recently a book on active defense, China's military strategy since 1949. But he's someone who's really looked at China's relations and its borderland relations specifically. And so we thought he would be an excellent candidate to sort of kick us off, to start thinking about how China's relations along its borderlands have been playing out. And hopefully set the context for, as I say, this series that we're planning on doing in YCW Global. We'll continue doing webinars even after webinars become unfashionable as we all return to normal life post-COVID. But we're looking forward to starting this discussion with him. So without further ado, Professor, again, thank you for taking the time for joining us for this, to kick off this series. I'm going to start with quite a broad question. Forgive me in advance, but I'm sure you'll be able to crystallize it quite well. You're someone who's looked at China's relations in all sorts of directions. You looked at a lot of the maritime ones and the land ones. As I said, this series is trying to focus on the land ones. I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit how, I guess from the Chinese government's perspective, these two differ. How do the land border relations differ from the maritime ones?
Great. Thanks so much, first off, for having me here, Raf. And it's great to be a part of this organization. I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm perhaps no longer young, but if I were young, it would have been great to have had something like this when I got started in the China field. So it's really great to see what all of you are doing. I think from the perspective of the Chinese government, or at least the Chinese government today, but also probably going back a much longer period of time in history, the land borders, I think, are fundamentally about kind of securing the sovereignty of and the territorial integrity of China. And that, of course, is a goal all nation states aspire to. But in China's case, the ethnic geography of the country and the fact that you have sort of the vast majority of the population, most of it would be under the sort of broad sort of category of Han Chinese, or sort of reside on slightly less than half of the country, in the eastern areas. And then you have these very large frontiers, including Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, perhaps Yunnan, parts of Yunnan as well, that are much, or has historically been sparsely populated and mostly populated with non-Han groups. And another way to think about this would be groups that, and this is a sort of a historical perspective, but one might see threads of this today, that groups that were never Sinified, right? So if one looks at sort of the expansion of the Chinese empires, going back several thousand years, and this idea of, sort of gradual expansion of the imperial system, primarily by sinifying groups that were sort of on the fringes of the core. And this has continued, or it continued over a long period of time. And of course, successive Chinese empires kind of would grow in size and scale. The Qing, of course, was the largest, or one of the largest in terms of mass, or in terms of size, and that included many areas that are now part of the People's Republic today, but weren't necessarily always part of any kind of Chinese or previous Chinese empire. And so you have this real distinctive ethnic geography. And then when the PRC was established as a state in 1949, these boundaries became frozen, if you will, right? And it's sort of in the earlier days, there was not this conception of borders as being, lines, discrete lines on maps that clearly delineated sort of the extent of sovereignty, right? Over time, right, one authority's influence would wane. Maybe there was a real borderland, right? And that's the kind of ungoverned space, and other authorities' power would gradually grow. But then the establishment of the PRC, and sort of before that, but really this last 100 years, borders became of the Qing, borders became much more important. And so I think for successive governments, to get back to answering your question, right, there is this sense that the borderlands or the frontiers would have to be more closely integrated into China. This is part of exercising and maintaining territorial integrity. There are specific threats to territorial integrity in these frontiers or borderlands, primarily because the folks who lived there were not Han Chinese. They were not well integrated into previous systems. They may have much stronger ties with kinsmen on the other side of China's international frontiers. They may have more natural trading relations across frontiers, and so on and so forth. That obviously is very different from the maritime space, because of course fish and not people live in the water. And so this governance question and this territorial integrity question in a sort of very truly territorial sense didn't apply. However, I think there's one interesting similarity, and I know you want to talk mostly about the land borders, but the similarity, I would say, would be that from a strategic perspective, China's long land border means that China has to manage multiple diplomatic relations simultaneously with many other countries, as 14 neighbors on land. And this just is a challenge, and at sea, right, depending on how one wants to count, maybe 8 sort of maritime neighbors. But I think the frontiers, although they're inside China, did effectively serve as a buffer, right, for this Han Chinese core in a military sense, where you trade time for space. So in the context, right, of an invasion, right, you could actually retreat, or you would not necessarily need to defend the border itself, because you really want to defend your core, and you could sort of manipulate that buffer to mobilize troops to repel an attack or anything else. And that, I think, endured certainly after 1949. In the maritime domain, one way to think about China's effort to increase, right, control in the waters off its coast, especially the South China Sea and East China Sea as well, right, is to create a buffer at sea to mirror the buffer in the frontiers on land, to protect, or to create that buffer, because the vast majority of wealth now resides in coastal provinces. And of course, from China's standpoint, there's a history of, particularly in the modern era, right, of threats coming from sea that also makes that important. So I would say there is this sort of interesting parallel in terms of viewing both as buffers, albeit one internally and sort of one that more directly abuts China's maritime neighbors.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think there seems to be a lot of similarities there in the way that you described them. I think your point about the ethnic links that probably stretch across land and create a different kind of dynamic there does distinguish the two. You sort of touch a bit upon this in your discussion just now, but I wonder if you could talk us through, at least within the sort of contemporary the CCP, since the Chinese Communist Party has been in sort of charge in China. How the various leaders have sort of managed or dealt, or has there been anything distinct about the manner in which they have focused or dealt with some of these borderland relations or borderland issues more generally? Have they sort of played a bigger or smaller part in some leaders' times than others?
That's a terrific question, really quite a challenging one to answer, because the history is pretty broad and pretty varied. And then also one would look at it, or one would have to decide, do you want to look at this internally in terms of basic domestic policy towards frontier areas and sort of ethnic autonomous regions in particular, or if one wants to look at it externally, right, in terms of the policies towards the countries that neighbor those areas. I think one could make some very broad general statements in the sense, I think in the beginning, right, in the 1950s. And so, I'm increasingly of the mind, right, there wasn't a single Mao era. There were multiple phases in Mao's rule of China. And the 50s is obviously quite different from what followed with the onset of the Cultural Revolution, maybe marked by the Great Leap. But in the beginning, I think, right, there was this sense of trying to govern some of these areas indirectly. So you could think of this as the way in which China initially approached Tibet, right, before seeking to really forcefully integrate it. The same could be said for much of Xinjiang, right? At the time of the establishment of the PRC, the dominant language in Xinjiang was Cyrillic because of the Russian influence. And so these were areas that could not easily be integrated into kind of quote China proper. Also from the perspective of infrastructure, right? These areas were quite remote in the sense of not having rail or substantial rail and road links. So when the PLA forces moved into Xinjiang, a number of them were airlifted by the Soviet Union, right? I mean, or by Russia. So, this is very different. I think, and then over time, this is going to be a broad generalization. Just on the internal side, I think after, say for Tibet, we would say the mid to late 1950s, the events, with the rebellion that started then leading to the Dalai Lama's flight. And then you had a really sort of nasty period of forcefully integrating Tibet into China. It was paradoxically described, right, as democratic reform, but it was neither democratic nor really reformist in any sense. In Xinjiang, it happens, I think, in a slightly different way, but a key turning point in the early 1960s is as relations with the Soviet Union deteriorate, there are concerns about remnant Soviet influence in Xinjiang, and actually there was no patrol border then, right? Like they were, until that time, right? These were fraternal socialist states, and fraternal socialist states didn't need borders because they were all, socialist brothers. And so the Soviets sort of mucked around a little bit, and there was this sort of incident in 1962 in which lots of residents of Xinjiang fled to the Soviet Union with Soviet encouragement, and that then led sort of to the development of what we now know as the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is playing a different role today in sort of cotton farming, but was really actually created in the first instance to create actually a buffer to control these border areas and to facilitate greater migration of Han Chinese. And that has been, I think, more prominent Han migration in Xinjiang and certainly Inner Mongolia than it has been in Tibet. For a variety of reasons, and that has sort of ebbed and flowed over time. I think in terms of external relations, internal relations, I would say, you have different periods when different leaders have sought to sort of make changes to sort of ethnic minority policies, sometimes tightening, sometimes loosening. So there was the early 1980s. And then I think we're seeing obviously a great tightening in the last 5 years under Xi Jinping, based, I think, on this underlying perception of how well integrated these areas are into the Han Chinese core. And that has, I think, a host of implications for how well developed they are along sort of the mainstream model and everything else, which I think is paradoxically a lot of tensions in these frontier areas or these borderlands. Externally, it's a slightly different story. I think when, and this is what I sort of found in my first book, when there has been unrest in these frontier areas, so the rebellion in Tibet, starting in the mid to late 50s, the unrest in Xinjiang I just talked about, China's been much more willing to engage its neighbors in order basically to kind of pacify the borders and prevent sort of neighboring states from exercising any influence that could upset instability in these areas or provide sanctuary to rebels and so on and so forth. And so you had a big push, right, for China to settle outstanding border disputes in the 60s with many states. It wasn't successful with all of them, you know, failed with India, for example, but was successful with Pakistan and Nepal and, you know, Mongolia, North Korea. Even there was an agreement in 1964 with the Soviets for the eastern sector. And that I think was really driven by what was happening internally, but it shaped the external policy. And then again, in the early 1990s, you sort of see this happening with the newly independent Central Asian states. And there was renewed, you know, sort of violence, political violence in Xinjiang, in part with folks who had returned from fighting in Afghanistan, that I think, and then sort of this vacuum of power in Central Asia made bringing about agreements with these states much more important than before. And so you saw a sort of pretty rapid succession of border agreements in various phases with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and then slightly later Tajikistan. But again, I think driven by this internal dynamic. And this probably, you could say, continues today. I mean, one can debate how severe what China describes as the terrorist threat in these borderlands is. It's most acute, I think, from China's standpoint in Xinjiang, but that does sustain kind of cooperation and engagement and the deepening of ties with Central Asian states. And in fact, I think this is what we're seeing with Afghanistan now, where, you know, everyone has got their hot take on China, Afghanistan, Taiwan, and credibility. But I think if one looks at the actual kind of engagements China's had with the Taliban, it has been basically to say, you know, our red line is that you can't become a source of instability inside China, and we'll sort of take it from there. And that, I think, reflects this much longer dynamic. So that was a longer answer to your question than you probably wanted, but it was a broad question. And so
it was a broad question. And I appreciate the way that you framed it. I thought that was really fascinating, the way that you sort of put it in those different, the internal and the external, and then touching on the sort of different phases that it went through. I think that kind of cuts to it. And I think the fascinating thing in some ways is how, until relatively recently, these were ill-defined borders. And I think the point you made about Tajikistan is that really only was, you know, agreed in the sort of 2000s, really, you know, and it's still, you know, some people on the ground still kind of dispute it and say, oh, well, actually, you know, we've got a deal. So it's fascinating how those things are still being issued today. And then, of course, you know, we look at the other side, we look at India, where we can see that those ill-defined borders are in fact a source of conflict where we're seeing lives being lost in a very sort of immediate way. And that kind of brings me on to my next question, which is, which of these do you think is most complicated from Beijing's perspective? Which of these kind of land borders, these borderland areas that they share, is the one that you think preoccupies Beijing most above all others?
I would say it's probably those that, you know, involving Xinjiang and thus the neighboring states, because of the fact that you have, I think, the greatest concern about an open challenge to Beijing's rule. The fact that I think Beijing's policies, which my own view have been misguided, right, of sort of imposing the Chinese economic modernization model in these areas has failed, and this has sort of created, you know, more resentment in these areas, means that that's just a very complicated set of issues to navigate, given how they're going about doing it. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be that complicated, but and then when you have 5 states, you know, 6 states actually neighboring Xinjiang, right? Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of India, right? Then you have a lot to manage for that one kind of frontier. I think the Tibetan frontier has historically been quite complicated for different reasons. It does abut India. Nepal, Bhutan, and even parts of Burma in the north. But I think over time, in part due to the way in which China pursued what I described in quotes as democratic reform in the early 1960s, and then the war with India as well, I think probably made that slightly less challenging to manage because, but not, again, from Beijing's standpoint, easy to manage, given that there's a government in exile from its point of view, in India, the Tibetan government. And so, China, as a function of its borderlands, or as a function of its kind of more complicated sovereignty more generally, it does view there being sort of two opposing governments, or at least historically two, one in Tibet and the other in Taiwan, with claims over territory that the PRC was controlling. And so I guess they all have their own challenges. I'm not sure one is more challenging than the other, but Xinjiang is such a large area. Actually, parts of it about Nepal, in Mongolia as well, and even so. I mean, it's 7 states. So in that sense, there's just a lot there to manage, and I think that's goes a long way to explaining China's dedication to the SCO, as well as this new C+5 mechanism with Central Asian states, and whatever will sort of develop with Afghanistan. I think first and foremost, China will view that through the lens of Xinjiang.
That's fascinating. So, I mean, Xinjiang is kind of the dominant one, because I suppose, this kind of also touches on a question that someone has put. And let me briefly there remind the audience that if you do want to ask a question, please feel free to feed it into the chat function or the Q&A function if you prefer, either one. And just please identify where you're writing us from, so we have a sense of kind of where our audience is coming from. And one of the questions that's already come from someone in Washington is, this point about Xinjiang you made, and Xinjiang in specifically at the moment has been in the news a lot because of Afghanistan and what we've seen happening in Afghanistan. And, we know that whenever, Wang Yi or any senior Chinese figure sort of engages with, Afghan counterparts, be it the Taliban or the previous Afghan government, worrying about East Turkestan Islamic movement is kind of top rank question that they actually raise up. And, as you pointed out, there was some evidence that in the sort of, in the wake of the, Soviet Mujahideen conflict, some individual Uyghurs did come back and cause some sorts of issues. And, I wonder if you could try to give us a sense, because there's a lot of kind of hyperbole around this threat and the size of this threat. And I wonder if you could try to, give us your sense of how substantial a threat do you think this really is? I mean, the former US government, US administration under President Trump said that this didn't even exist. The organization that China is worried about didn't even exist, and they removed it from the list of prescribed terrorist organizations. I wonder if you give us a sense of what your perception of that threat actually is. And then maybe if you could expand a little bit more on the kind of historical context that underpins that. And is this a threat that maybe was more substantial before, is less now, or was less before and is more now? Could you give us that sort of sense of that relationship that China has?
Sure. I mean, I think from a conventional sort of definition of terrorism or of armed organizations, it's really not much of a threat at all, in the sense of involving large numbers of people who can pose a credible challenge to the authority of the state, and do so in a coordinated fashion over a significant area of territory. I mean, I think the most significant internal threat to China and its borderlands was the revolt in Tibet, which resulted in a 3-year, military pacification campaign that, quite frankly, is just not well understood outside of China. It's something I've always wanted to write more about, just because I think it's an important part of that history. Whereas in Xinjiang, you had in the 1990s kind of localized uprisings in different areas, but they did not appear to be coordinated. But it did sort of reflect, I think, the sense that central control over Xinjiang was not nearly as strong as it thought it was, and this led to successive strike hard campaigns. And then, more recently, you had clearly, terrorist violence in other parts of China by by some, individuals, but they didn't seem to be, such as the train station attacks. But they didn't seem to be a coordinated, effort as part of a movement, much less well organized in any kind of sort of military sense. And so, but obviously a lot of resentment and sort of unrest. Not a lot. I mean, some resentment, a lot of resentment, some unrest. Be clear about that. And I think Sheena Greitens and her colleagues have written a terrific article in International Security on this. So that I think from an not objective, at least from my analytical perspective, no one's really objective, but from my, it seems to be vastly overblown and the response wildly disproportionate, right? And so which is not to say, right, there have not been groups of individuals or episodes where there's been kind of either an effort to terrorize or to kind of violently resist sort of central authority. But in the sense of being, in terms of scope and scale, right, it does not seem to be akin to what we might view in other areas. But it clearly, I think for China's leaders, seems to be worrisome enough that it has led them down their current sort of course of action. And as we're paradoxically seeing with COVID, there sort of is, there appears to just be a zero tolerance for any kind of, resistance, even if it's civil and nonviolent, to sort of central authority, and a real effort to kind of stamp that out in a way that is certainly unprecedented, right, in terms of how China has governed or sought to govern these areas and Xinjiang in particular. And so, this is my perspective from outside of China. But I think if one thinks about terrorist groups and movements in a comparative context, I'm not even sure, from a comparative politics kind of perspective, how many times Xinjiang ever features in those studies. I'm guessing, and it's not for lack of knowledge. I just don't think it meets kind of the threshold we would normally establish for those kinds of events and actors.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very difficult. Clearly, something has been happening there, but there's a real sense of the Chinese response does seem disproportionate to the nature of the actual threat that they face. I wonder, and I see some other questions have come in, actually asking questions about some of the maritime borders. So I'll maybe put that one to you, and then I'll come back to something else I was going to ask about looking at the land borders. And we've had a question from someone called, from Rabbi in Oxford, which I presume means you are a religious persuasion. And so Rabbi says that Russia's invasion and occupation of Crimea and China's claim and occupation of a large chunk of the South China Sea within the Philippine territory, despite the ICJ ruling, and is our toleration of these acts by nations creating a worrying new, precedent in international law? The fact that we sort of the fact that we've seen China sort of asserting itself, and if we switch this to the kind of land relations, I think in a lot of those cases they've been negotiated relatively peacefully. Though, as you can see with India, it's still not, and I think with Bhutan as well, we're still dealing with kind of ill-defined ones. And do you think this kind of I don't really know how to phrase it, what the proper word would be, where where China in particular has been sort of taking this territory or creating a de facto context on the ground? Is there something, I guess, that there should have been more aggressive pushback maybe from the West in particular into holding China back at sort of previous borders? And do you think it has really changed the reality on the ground in a sort of incontestable way? So
I think there are two elements there are two elements to both to the question and then to your question. So on international law in Crimea and the South China Sea, the legal contexts are actually quite different. I mean, I think Crimea is probably a pretty clear-cut case of the right of self-defense in the UN Charter being violated and not being kind of resisted. And so you could view that as over time, right, further weakening that element of the UN Charter. So, in contrast, say, with the invasion and occupation of Kuwait, going back to 1990, I think clearly there are some elements there. The South China Sea, though, is different in a number of respects. And so first, right, in terms of that contested land that would invoke the right to self-defense, that situation, right, has not changed appreciably in the last 10 to 15 years, with the exception of land reclamation. But in terms of the features that all the various claimants, including China, hold, right, that has basically been frozen. You know, the last features were occupied, I think, in the late 1990s. Vietnam may have built on 2 more sort of submerged shoals, but in terms of the main land features, right, these were in the Spratlys, these were all occupied from the 70s to the late 80s and very early 1990s. And of course, when sovereignty is contested, the right of self-defense can be invoked by all parties, which means legally, and I'm not a legal scholar by any stretch, it's just a different kind of situation. So everyone can claim the right of self-defense in a territorial dispute, especially what I like to call the world's most complicated territorial dispute, which is in the South China Sea. And the legal context is different as well. The tribunal is actually held under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It was not the ICJ, right? So it was not adjudicating questions of territorial sovereignty. In fact, you know, the purpose of the tribunal was to basically determine the scope of lawful maritime claims from the land features that the different claimants occupied or held. And the main conclusion, right, was that none of the features in the Spratlys met the definition of an island under the convention, or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and thus were not entitled to significant maritime entitlements, specifically a 200 nautical mile EEZ. But the tribunal didn't address, and deliberately did not address, this question of territorial sovereignty. And so what China has done is not occupy more land and thus weaken that part of international law. It is basically significantly increased its, this is getting to your part of the question, Raf, significantly increased, right, its ability to effectively sort of exercise presence and increasing control in the waters of the South China Sea, including within the exclusive economic zones of coastal states, most notably the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Right, China has this very amorphous claim to historic rights, which was always lurking in the background, was made official in 2016, but then still never defined. But in practice, right, China seems to be claiming rights, inside the 9-, within the 9- line, but also inside the EEZs of, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Now, the tribunal did find, right, that China unlawfully occupied Mischief Reef when it did occupy Mischief Reef because it was a low tide elevation and thus not a land feature subject to appropriation by another state. And so in that sense, China is illegally occupying this land feature within the Philippine EEZ. So, but it was not sort of, or it was seized in 1994. I think it's slightly different from the Crimea situation. So the real issue, I think, in the South China Sea, sort of unlike, Crimea, which was, this sort of literally in the dark of night kind of annexation, is, right, China's been steadily building its presence in the South China Sea over 2 decades. The land reclamation was a real sort of step function change in that process, although it really began much earlier, because now you have these forward operating posts where China can base Coast Guard vessels, fishing vessels, as well as a whole range of military assets, and then can use that to increase its presence, and thus this kind of perception of effective control. But again, water space is very different from territory. The U.S. and China have a significant disagreement over what is or what constitutes freedom of navigation. But even, I think on certain readings, right, China does, can't, or it's not claiming that, right, that the South China Sea is territorial waters, which would be a legal claim that might be more akin to something happening in Crimea, right, over which it would exercise almost, de facto sovereignty, much less internal waters. So I think in that sense it's different. But at all, I don't want to downplay, right, the way in which China's profile and presence and ultimate ability to control, parts of the South China Sea has really significantly changed, but it's been gradual and over time. And in that sense, I think the legal implications are slightly different than Crimea.
Understood. I think that's an interesting separation of the two out. So, thank you so much for that. I see we've got another question looking at Afghanistan, which I'll come to in 1 minute. But I want to pick up on another final point I wanted to quickly ask you about these borderland relations specifically, and to touch something that you sort of mentioned briefly in your comments, which is these sort of cross-border communities. And the fact that you have got in a lot of these borderland countries, people on both sides of the border that ethnically are the same, they probably see themselves as the same and don't really recognize the border in the same way as, the nation state that they purport to live under, or the nation state that they do live under, defines it. And so they don't necessarily interpret it. And I'm just wondering how much those considerations play into kind of Beijing's thinking about how they worry about this, or is it something that in some ways is kind of marginal to Beijing's considerations? Because at the end of the day, the one thing about China, well, one of the many things about China, is that it really is a mono-ethnic state. It's predominantly, in an overwhelming majority way, Han Chinese, and these communities are really fringe ones, very small on the kind of borderland regions. I mean, so how much do you think that China's policy towards some of these borderland countries is driven by those borderland communities, or by bigger sort of geopolitics? And then I'll switch. So I see a whole bevy of questions come in, which I will process and then put to you in a second.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, broadly speaking, China has worried about those trans-border communities, right, when they have the potential to exercise significant influence within China. As sources of support, information, it can take different forms in different times. It's also, the size of these communities varies by border. The largest one would actually be right in the Northeast with Korea, because you have, 5 to 10 million, don't quote me on the number, in that range, right, ethnic Koreans who are, Chinese citizens, against a peninsula with, however many million, 60 million people are living on the peninsula, right? So that's clearly the largest one. But that relationship, right, is a very different, that one doesn't really do that as a borderland in the same sense, because of sort of the centrality of Northeast China going back to the Manchus, and then Japanese occupation, industrialization, the war, Korean War, and everything else. You'd also have, lesser numbers, but in Mongolia, clearly that would be a factor. But Inner Mongolia, at least, has been so significantly, or the ethnic Mongol presence in Inner Mongolia is relatively small, and that is a function of proximity, right, to the core. Then in Xinjiang, you have some trans-border communities such as Kazakhs, and even today, right, you still have lots of folks maybe living in one country and working in another, and some of these folks, right, tragically have been ensnared in the current repression. Oftentimes, one learns about the repression from these folks who've been able to then leave China, and then of course India, Nepal, you have the Tibetan communities, but I think there's just been less kind of trans-border movement. Now, I think this would really, or it was a most significant issue when the borders were most porous, right, which is really the period of the 50s and the 60s. And then you have a different sort of issue in, adjacent to Myanmar, Burma, right, which is lots of ethnic Chinese resident in that area, and so it's a different sort of kinship kind of agreement. And so, so again, there's no real clear pattern, in part because I think each of these borderlands has different characteristics and features, which make it unique in the sense of wanting to understand how these different groups have played a role in different periods of time. But I would say, from the government's perspective, I think it's really the attitude and the affect of the neighboring state, whether and what it will sort of allow sort of the trans-border community to do within their state that China focuses on. But it really treats the neighboring state, right, as the main actor or agent in addressing this problem, and less kind of the communities themselves.
Interesting. I mean, that makes sense. You know, Beijing's ruling the country; they're not ruling for these people. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. One, the first one from Andreas in Chengdu, who asks about Afghanistan, and will the Chinese government maintain their communications with the Taliban, worrying about their sort of joint border security, through an offer of sort of financial support? Or do you think that the Taliban is no threat to China? And how do you see the Belt and Road playing in to the kind of future of the kind of China-Afghanistan relationship in particular?
So China's border with Afghanistan is its shortest border, less than 100. I think it's less than 100 miles or less than 100 kilometers.
70 kilometers, I think.
70 kilometers, thank you. Right, and it's really just this strip of the Wakhan corridor. And so in some sense, right, the potential for spillover is not great and is pretty easy to control if you're focusing very specifically on how one might go from one country to the other country. I think what China's objectives in Afghanistan would be to see kind of stability defined in many different ways, but to include sort of stability that would mean no spillover into China or no spillover into other countries that then neighbor China that could spill over into China. And so I think that means its desire for the Taliban would be to see it govern the country with those objectives in mind, and not to harbor greater kind of revisionist sort of ideas, whether that's in Pakistan or anywhere else, right? That would really complicate things for China. And so I think they're pretty minimal objectives. I still don't really know what the Belt and Road means. But the question, the practical questions would be: will China want to invest more in Afghanistan? Will it want to trade more with Afghanistan? If those are the principal, manifestations of the Belt and Road, I think China will be opportunistic, but take a pretty cautious attitude. It's not necessarily clear how stable the Taliban's rule will be. Already there are pockets of opposition, and China's had 20 years, right, to develop economic ties and investment with Afghanistan under sort of the American security umbrella, and really didn't do that much, right? I mean, there's the investment in the copper mine, but given at least the scope and scale of the mineral deposits people believe to be there, right? There was an opportunity to begin developing these earlier on that wasn't pursued, which makes me think that, again, China will have pretty minimal objectives going forward, and really primarily going back to the focus of our conversation earlier on, focusing first and foremost what this means for stability in Xinjiang, and then stability in Central Asia, right, as it relates to kind of China's Western frontier. And so China's being very practical, like other countries. I mean, China's not the only country to have reached out to the Taliban, which is important to note, right? I mean, you have Russia and India and others doing the same, and because it's in their interest to have communication and contact with what appears to be, the ruling or what would be the governing authorities in the country. And of course, even America was negotiating with the Taliban under the Trump administration. And so, in that sense, I think we really do have to wait and see. I'm much more comfortable talking about the past than the future. Certainly, my scholarly disposition leads me in that way. But I suspect, China understands the risks of being more deeply involved in Afghanistan. It's watched that very closely. It has very little experience in those kinds of operations, beyond its borders. And so I really don't see China rushing in to fill kind of the vacuum that the U.S. is leaving, and instead preferring to support the existing authorities with the goal of stability in mind, and then see what opportunities might arise in the future in terms of its economic interests. But Afghanistan is not going to be a big trading partner, right? I mean, it's still one of the poorest countries in the world. So, like how's that going to work out with the Belt and Road? I mean, it just doesn't. It seems like there are many more important countries if one views the Belt and Road in terms of trade and investment in Afghanistan, that China would probably want to focus on.
Yeah, I think that's a very clear statement, which I'd concur with. I think the interesting dynamic in some ways that I wonder about with Afghanistan is that actually, of course, China is Afghanistan's richest neighbor. And so there's kind of, if you switch that on its head, it does change the dynamic a little bit. It does make you think that China should have probably a much more responsible and proactive role there. And it's sort of interesting that they haven't, and they don't seem to be, even now, in the context that we're seeing of the US leaving. I'm conscious we're coming up to the sort of the end of our time. We've got another really good question, which I'll put to you, but I'll just throw one final out to the audience. If anyone does have any questions they want to do, I'd encourage them to put them in now. Please keep them short and snappy, and then we should be able to hopefully put them to Professor Fravel. But turning to the next question we have, which is from JT Spielman in Amsterdam. And he asks, about the land border draft law. What is the rationale behind developing this law now? What legal void for border management does it aim to fill? And is it usual for countries to have land border laws in this way? Which is quite a specific and technical question, but I'm sure you'll have a clear answer to it.
I don't have a clear answer to it. I have not read the draft law, and so I don't want to comment on it in the specifics. But I would say, if you think about China and law, right, it is trying to legislate so many things. I mean, this is sort of, legislate is not even quite the right word. I mean, the laws are sort of rules that are being developed. And so, right, China's developing an ocean law. And I think China basically wants to ensure that all areas have very clear rules to follow. I suspect what would be driving this would be the fact that you probably had more local, in some areas, ad hoc approaches to some of these issues that would then need to be codified and standardized in a piece of legislation coming out of the NPC. And I think you also have a separate trend, which we didn't really touch upon, which is that many of these borderlands are now much more well developed than before. And finally, the sort of the infrastructure of kind of China proper really is reaching the borders, right, with the train lines into Tibet. And so I think now these areas are being much more closely integrated into kind of the overall Chinese system and structure, such that may be creating a demand for this legislation. But it's a great reminder that I need to take a look at it. So thanks for the question.
I'm glad you're walking away from the session with some homework then as well.
Yes, we always have homework.
Well, it's a study as a constant sort of process. I know. I wonder if then, in the sort of last minutes that we have, I could bring kind of a broader question to you, which is really more, rather than appealing to the kind of the Borderlands questions, which I think you've covered in a really interesting and comprehensive way. And I think the points you made there at the end about how, the internal infrastructure reaching China's borders is changing to some degree its relationship with these places. And I think that's probably driving a lot of, policy. And I always think it's quite interesting to think about, the march westward that we saw under Jiang Zemin, which was kind of about this as well, and started happening then, but I would argue it's only really started happening more recently, where you've actually seen the infrastructure reaching out there, and then the Belt and Road in a way is a way of kind of then pulling that out even further. So you've got a kind of interesting dynamic that's starting to play out there, which I think is going to mean that these borderlands maybe will be more significant in sort of Beijing's thinking. But I think to sort of wrap it maybe up with a sort of broader question, which is focusing more on the other side of YCW, which is, we're an organization that is focused on trying to help, build connections and develop the, up and coming generations of people interested in China. The name Young China Watchers, some people see as quite menacing, but it's not intended in that way. It's really about curiosity and interest. And, we have a really vibrant community of people around the world and different chapters in, as I say, 10 different cities who are all, interested in China and working on China in some cases, people who aren't actually getting to work on China, but are interested in it because they spent some time there and want to find a way back in. So I guess, we're in a situation now where the dominant narrative about China and the West in particular is one of conflict. And so if we look at it from that perspective, that this is kind of the narrative of the world that people are now trying to get into or work into when they want to get involved in China studies in some way, shape, or form. You know, as someone with a lot of experience working on China studies, and you know, a very prominent professor, well published, widely published, you know, a very prominent institution, looking at these questions, what advice would you give to people now who are trying to explore a career in the kind of China space? What kind of advice would you give them? And you know, if there was some way of tying Borderlands into that, it would be fantastic, but don't feel by any stretch bound to that particular part. I think it would just be, you know, some thoughts from your perspective of how, you know, younger people who are interested in trying to get involved in kind of China studies, what should they be thinking about or focusing on these days when, you know, the dominant narrative is this one of conflict and confrontation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm not sure I have a very good answer to it. I think, you know, I entered the field at a time when China was changing pretty rapidly. It appeared to be changing, it appeared to be becoming, from an intellectual standpoint, more open, more vibrant, more willing to discuss the past. And that all those things, right, are moving now in the opposite direction. And so from a scholarly standpoint, I think it's a reminder, right, that there's always a broader political context. And I just didn't understand that when I started out, I was in a particular context, and I'm now in my not so young age, right, realizing that this has changed. But if I talked to some of my mentors and advisors, right, they got into the China field in the 60s, where field work consisted of going to Hong Kong and using binoculars to read, you know, big character posters, you know, across the fence, you know, I mean, and then speaking with refugees. And so in other words, like, we are entering a period of, I think, yeah, where there is going to be, I think, a greater tension in a general sense, I think, but it's not unprecedented. And of course, I think whatever the future holds, right, having a better understanding of China, right, will contribute to, or has many great contributions to make, right? Even if it's navigating a more challenging policy environment, you still want to make sure you're making good policy choices based upon actual knowledge, as opposed to simplistic policy choices based upon, you know, bad information. But it's tough. I mean, I think there's no beating around the bush. Like, again, I'm speaking from a scholarly perspective versus, say, the, you know, business communities and other communities. I would say, though, more generally, right, China's such a vast and large country. There's so many interesting facets. My advice, I think, to younger folks, regardless of whether you're pursuing the academic route or other routes, is to really find a few aspects that you're most interested in learning more about, and to pursue them really deeply and vigorously and intently, such that you really become kind of expert in them, because it's that expertise that I think is useful, whatever is useful, regardless of however you want to, whatever endeavor you're going into, whether it's, you know, business, politics, scholarship, theater, whatever it is, to just really find something that you want to, that will sort of sustain your interest, especially as the political sort of environment will wax and wane, but I think generally be a bit tighter than it's been for a while. It doesn't seem to me as if this is, you know, going to loosen. We talk a lot in the China field about these Fang and Shou cycles of opening and tightening, and this might just be a much longer cycle of tightening. Who knows, though, right? I mean, I'm not sure how many people really predicted the current cycle of tightening. I mean, we look back now, maybe it was inevitable, but I don't see a lot of people in 2011 kind of saying this is the way in which China would evolve. But you know, so it's still very important to do. Whatever country you're from, right? China is now, you know, an important part of you know, political and economic life for most states around the world. And so in that sense, this kind of engagement and inquiry and activity is super important. It's just happening in a slightly different way than I think when I sort of came of age, if I can say that, in the China field.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a salutary reminder that we shouldn't get too caught up in these things. And I think if you're passionate and interested, stick to it. And as you say, these waves will come and go, and I think you just have to push forward. But we have come up to the top of the hour. And I am very eager always to try to keep things to schedule. So I'm hugely appreciative again to Professor Fravel for taking the time to join us. And thank you so much for our wonderful audience for tuning in from all over the world. We've had questions from all 3 continents, which is always very fun to see happening. And it's great that we are able to really kick off this Borderland series with such a wonderful and wide-ranging discussion covering it. The webinar is going to go up onto our YouTube channel afterwards, and we'll promote it subsequently. We'll send you a link if you would like Professor and other watchers to sort of disseminate it more further. I also must give a note of thanks to my wonderful colleagues Josh and Sam, who are respectively in DC and Hong Kong, again echoing this global thing, who've really been the motors to keep this thing going. So thank you very much, Professor Fravel. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thanks for your wonderful questions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session, which we haven't got to pin down a date for yet, but it's probably going to be related to Central Asia, and it's probably going to be sometime in a month. So we will keep an eye out for that, and we'll be sending out information about that. You can get more on all YCW stuff from our website, youngchinawatchers.com, where you can also sign up to our newsletter, amongst other things. So thank you very much, and have a very good day, good evening, or good afternoon, depending where you are. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.